The forest was still, with only the occasional rustling of leaves and the sound of a distant bird call breaking the silence. Jack had been hiking for hours, enjoying the quiet of the wilderness far from the noise of the city. He loved this time alone in nature, where nothing could distract him from his thoughts. The trail he followed was narrow and winding, cutting through thick trees and uneven ground. He was a man who had spent much of his life in the military, and the peace of the woods was a welcome change from the chaos of his past. As he walked, a strange noise caught his attention, something unlike the usual sounds of the forest. It was a low hum, followed by a sudden sharp crack that echoed through the trees. Jack stopped in his tracks. His trained instincts told him something was wrong, but he couldn't yet place it. The noise came again, louder this time, and with it the unmistakable sound of something crashing through the sky. Jack's heart raced as he looked up. Far above, a streak of bright light shot across the sky, twisting and tumbling, as if it were struggling to stay aloft. It wasn't a meteor. Jack knew that. It was too slow, too controlled. His mind raced through possible explanations, none of them making sense. He knew one thing for sure: whatever it was coming down fast. He didn't think twice. Dropping his backpack, Jack took off running toward the source of the noise, his boots pounding against the earth. The forest seemed to grow denser the closer he got, branches brushing against his face. But he pushed forward. He had no idea what was happening, but he had to find out. After a few minutes, he emerged into a clearing and stopped dead in his tracks. There, in the middle of the forest, lay the wreckage of a ship. It was like nothing Jack had ever seen before. The craft, large and twisted, had crashed into the ground with such force that the trees around it were snapped and bent, as though they had been no match for its impact. Smoke and sparks rose from the wreckage, and Jack could hear the crackling of burning metal. His first thought was that it must be some kind of military craft, but as he approached, he realized it wasn't anything he recognized. The ship's surface was covered in strange markings, glowing faintly in the dim light. The metal itself was unlike anything from Earth, smooth and black, with sharp, angular shapes that seemed almost alive. Jack crouched beside the wreckage, his eyes scanning the area. He saw no signs of life at first. There were no bodies, no signs of movement. But then, just as he was about to turn away, something caught his eye. A small figure, barely visible among the twisted metal. A person, or something like a person. His heart skipped a beat. A girl, lying motionless beneath the wreckage. She was humanoid in shape, but everything about her screamed alien. Her skin was a pale blue, with faint patterns running across her arms and face, like tattoos or some sort of markings. Her hair was long and silver, tangled around her face. She was unconscious, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Jack could see that she was hurt, very hurt. Blood, bright blue, not like human blood, was oozing from a wound on her side, and her breathing was ragged, like she was barely holding on to life. Without hesitation, Jack rushed to her side. His training kicked in. He checked for a pulse. It was faint, but there. He knew he didn't have much time. Carefully, he lifted her from beneath the wreckage, doing his best to avoid making her injuries worse. She was light, almost fragile, but there was a strength in her that he could feel. Jack didn't know who or what she was, but that didn't matter now. The only thing that mattered was getting her somewhere safe. He couldn't just leave her here to die. He looked around, trying to think quickly. There was no one else around, no sign of any other survivors or attackers. The ship was the only thing out of place in this quiet forest. He needed to get her help, but he was miles from civilization. His cabin wasn't far. He had built it himself years ago, deep in the forest, far away from the nearest town. It was small but sturdy, with enough supplies to last him months. If he could get her there, he could at least keep her alive long enough to figure out what was going on. Carefully, Jack lifted the alien girl into his arms, cradling her gently as he began the long walk back to his cabin. He moved quickly, his military training allowing him to navigate the terrain with ease. The whole time, he couldn't shake the feeling that something huge had just happened, something he had no way of understanding yet. But he didn't care. Right now, all that mattered was the girl in his arms. She needed him, and Jack was determined to help her. The forest closed in around him, but Jack didn't notice. His mind was focused on only one thing, getting her to safety. The walk back to the cabin seemed to take forever. Jack's muscles ached from the weight of the alien girl in his arms, but he didn't stop. He had no idea what had happened to her, or where she had come from, but one thing was clear: she was not from Earth. That much was undeniable. Her strange appearance, her unusual blood, and the wreckage of her ship all told him that she was something entirely different from anything he had ever seen. His cabin was tucked away in a small valley, hidden from the main trails and roads. It was the perfect place for someone who wanted to be left alone. Jack had built it years ago, after leaving the military. The quiet solitude of the forest was his refuge from the noise and chaos of the world. But now, as he made his way toward the cabin with the mysterious girl in his arms, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change forever. By the time he reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow over the trees. Jack pushed open the door with his shoulder and carefully stepped inside, making sure not to jostle the girl too much. He laid her gently on the couch, the only piece of furniture large enough to hold her. He had no medical supplies for something like this, but he knew enough to keep her still and quiet while he figured out what to do next. Jack stepped back, looking at the girl carefully. She was still unconscious, her long silver hair spread out across the couch, her breathing shallow and uneven. He felt a strange tug at his heart, a mix of curiosity and something deeper, something protective. He had no idea who she was, but something told him that her survival depended on him. He glanced around the cabin, trying to think of what to do. His first instinct was to call for help, but there was no phone signal out here in the forest. The nearest town was miles away, and by the time he could get there, it might be too late. He needed to act quickly. Jack turned toward the small kitchen area and grabbed a clean cloth. He wet it with cold water from a nearby sink and returned to the girl's side. Her skin was cool to the touch, and he could see the faint outline of bruises and cuts on her face. He wiped her forehead gently, trying to soothe her, though she remained still, unaware of his efforts. Her wounds were unlike anything he had ever seen. The blood on her side was still oozing, and Jack could tell it wasn't like human blood. It was a deep, glowing blue, almost unnatural. He had no idea how to treat an injury like that, but he couldn't just leave her to suffer. He rummaged through his cabin, gathering what he could: bandages, antiseptic, anything he thought might help. As he worked, his mind raced. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why had her ship crashed on Earth of all places? Jack's mind kept drifting back to the wreckage. The ship had been unlike anything he had ever seen. The materials were smooth, shiny, and black, almost like the metal was alive. It didn't belong in the forest. It didn't belong on Earth. But there it was, and now Jack was faced with the responsibility of helping the girl who had survived it. It wasn't long before the girl stirred. Her eyes flickered open, blinking rapidly as if trying to make sense of her surroundings. Jack froze, watching her closely. Her eyes were a bright, glowing green, another sign that she wasn't human. She looked around the room in confusion, her gaze locking on him for a brief moment before shifting away. Jack took a cautious step forward. "Hey, it's okay. You're safe," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. He wasn't sure if she could understand him, but he had to try. Her eyes darted to the window, then back at him. Her breath quickened, and she tried to sit up, but a sharp wince crossed her face as she placed a hand on her side. Jack immediately stepped closer, gently pushing her back down. "You're hurt," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "Stay still. I'm not going to hurt you." The girl's eyes narrowed as if she didn't fully trust him. She said something in a language Jack didn't understand. Her voice was soft, almost musical, but full of urgency. He had no idea what she was saying, but the tone of her voice told him that she was scared. Jack didn't know how to calm her down, but he had to try. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small knife, just in case, though he wasn't sure what use it would be against whatever this girl was. "I don't know what you're saying, but I'll help you," he said quietly, as if speaking to a frightened animal. "I don't know how, but I'll try." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, to Jack's surprise, the girl blinked, her expression softening slightly. She raised a hand, as if trying to gesture that she understood. It was a small step, but for Jack, it was enough. He could see in her eyes that she wasn't a threat. She was just scared, alone, and in pain. And for reasons Jack couldn't explain. He knew he couldn't leave her like that. Not now. The bond between them was fragile, but Jack had made a promise to himself that he would do whatever it took to help her. Whatever secret she carried, whatever danger she might bring, Jack knew one thing: she wasn't alone anymore. The days passed in a quiet rhythm, the kind that Jack had grown used to over the years. The sound of the wind through the trees, the crackle of the fire in the hearth, the quiet solitude of the cabin. It was all familiar, but nothing about the last few days had been familiar. Nothing about the girl was familiar. Jack spent most of his time trying to care for her, making sure she was comfortable and well-fed. He found that she drank water when offered, but she never spoke in any way he could understand. Her eyes followed him carefully, always alert, but there was a clear wariness in her gaze. She had not yet fully trusted him, but Jack could see the tension in her body slowly starting to ease. She wasn't afraid of him anymore, but she was still cautious. Her name was still unknown. She had not spoken since the first time she woke up, and Jack hadn't pressed her. The language she had spoken was unlike anything he had ever heard. It was soft and flowing, but it carried an unfamiliar cadence that made it impossible for him to mimic or understand. Over the next few days, Jack focused on helping her recover. He had some basic medical knowledge from his time in the military, and although he couldn't treat the alien girl's injuries perfectly, he did what he could. Her side wound had started to heal, though it left a scar. Her breathing had steadied, and her strength seemed to return little by little. One evening, Jack was sitting at the small wooden table, cleaning his rifle and checking the perimeter for any signs of danger, when he heard soft footsteps behind him. He turned around to see the girl standing in the doorway, her silver hair falling in loose strands over her shoulders. Her eyes were wide with curiosity, and for the first time, she didn't seem afraid. "Hey, you're up," Jack said, putting the rifle down and standing. He smiled, though he wasn't sure if she would understand the gesture. She nodded, looking around the cabin. Her gaze landed on the window, and Jack could see her studying the outside world. It seemed like she was trying to understand her surroundings. She had been quiet for days, but now she appeared to be more aware of her situation. Jack didn't know what to say, so he just stood there, watching her. His curiosity was growing. Who was she? Where had she come from? What was the ship she had arrived in? But he didn't ask. Not yet. Instead, he gestured to the small fire that crackled in the corner of the room. "You hungry?" Jack asked, hoping she would understand. He had some food left from the last hunting trip, and he'd prepared a simple stew over the fire. The girl's eyes lingered on the food for a moment, and then she nodded slowly. It was a small sign of cooperation, but it meant something to Jack. He set a bowl of stew on the table and slid it toward her. She cautiously picked up a spoon, staring at it as if it were something strange. After a moment, she brought the spoon to her lips and tasted the stew. Jack watched her, waiting for any reaction. The girl's expression changed for a brief moment. She smiled, just a little. It wasn't a wide smile, but it was enough for Jack to feel a glimmer of hope. She ate slowly, taking small bites, clearly unfamiliar with the way humans ate. Jack didn't mind. It was progress. She was trying. and that was more than he had expected. As the meal went on, Jack found himself growing more comfortable with her presence. He wasn't sure why, but something about her made him want to protect her. He felt a strange connection, a pull to this alien girl who had crash-landed in his world. She wasn't like any other person he had known, yet he couldn't ignore the feeling that they shared something deeper. After the meal, the girl seemed content to sit by the fire, her eyes flickering between the flames and Jack. He decided to try something different. Slowly, he reached into his bag and pulled out a small piece of paper and a pen. He wasn't sure if she could read, but he wanted to try to communicate with her. Maybe, if he showed her something familiar, it would help bridge the gap between them. He drew a simple symbol, a line with a curve on top, a circle. It was basic, but it was something Jack had seen in his military training when trying to communicate with people from other cultures. He pointed to the symbol, then looked at her. "This," Jack said softly, "is a symbol. It means safe." The girl's eyes narrowed, her curiosity piqued. She studied the symbol for a long moment before she nodded slightly, as if she understood. Jack wasn't sure if that was the case, but it was the first sign of understanding between them. He felt a little lighter, like they were slowly finding a common ground. For the next hour, they sat in silence, Jack drawing simple symbols and trying to communicate. The girl didn't speak, but she watched him carefully, and sometimes she would gesture or point, trying to show that she understood what he was doing. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That night, as Jack lay on the small cot near the fire, he thought about the girl. Who was she? What had happened to her people? Why had her ship crashed on Earth? And what was he going to do now? He didn't know the answers, but one thing was certain. He was no longer alone, and neither was she. Together, they were an unlikely team, brought together by fate, or by something else Jack couldn't yet understand. But one thing was clear. Whatever danger she was running from, whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face it together. Jack had already made up his mind. He would protect her, no matter the cost. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet routine Jack had come to enjoy in his isolated cabin was slowly beginning to feel different. The girl, who Jack had taken to calling Lyra, had grown stronger each day. She still didn't speak much, but there was a new warmth in her eyes when she looked at him, and that made all the difference. Jack found himself growing more and more protective of her, and despite the mystery surrounding her, he couldn't shake the feeling that her presence in his life was no coincidence. However, as much as Jack wanted to ignore the strange events that had brought Lyra to Earth, there was one problem he could no longer avoid. They were not alone. Jack had always been cautious, but his years in the military had taught him to trust his instincts. And right now, his instincts were screaming that danger was approaching. It wasn't just the quiet in the forest or the strange, unexplainable feeling that something was off. It was the way Lyra had begun to react. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Jack noticed her looking nervously toward the edge of the forest. Her expression was tense, her eyes scanning the darkening woods, her body stiff with anticipation. Jack followed her gaze, but there was nothing there, just the usual shadows of the trees and the distant rustling of leaves. Yet he could feel it too, a change in the air, a feeling of being watched. "Lyra," Jack said softly, stepping closer. "What is it? What do you see?" She didn't answer, but her hand twitched as if she wanted to point, but hesitated. Jack could see the fear in her eyes, even though she didn't speak. He had never seen her so agitated before. She wasn't a creature of flight, but there was something in her demeanor that said she was about to run. Jack's heart raced. He knew it wasn't just his imagination anymore. He reached for his rifle, keeping his movements slow and deliberate so as not to startle her. "We need to be careful," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure if she understood the words. He hoped the tone of his voice conveyed the urgency. He glanced around, scanning the trees and the darkening forest beyond. There was no sound now, just the stillness of the evening, but that only made the tension more noticeable. Jack had learned long ago that silence in the wilderness was often a sign of danger. It wasn't just the normal creatures of the forest that kept quiet when something else was near. It was something else, something unnatural. As the night grew darker, Jack's instincts told him they weren't alone. They had been spotted. They were being hunted. Then, as if to confirm his worst fears, the faint hum of engines filled the air, a low, menacing sound, like something massive approaching. Jack's breath caught in his throat. The sound was coming from the sky. He turned to Lyra, his mind racing. He needed to act. Fast. Without waiting for another moment, he grabbed her arm gently but firmly. "We have to move," he said, his voice low but urgent. She didn't resist, her eyes wide with understanding. And she nodded, her body already moving with him as they made their way toward the back door of the cabin. Jack had prepared for this. He always had an escape route planned, just in case. He didn't know who was after them, but he had to assume they would stop at nothing to find her. As they ran, Jack heard the unmistakable sound of a ship descending, the hum of powerful engines growing louder. It wasn't long before the glow of searchlights sliced through the trees. Jack and Lyra ran deeper into the forest, the thick underbrush slowing them down, but they couldn't afford to stop. Jack glanced over his shoulder just in time to see a massive shadow pass overhead, a ship so large it blocked out the stars above. Lyra was moving swiftly beside him, but Jack could see the fear in her eyes as they dashed through the trees. She wasn't just running for her life. She was running from something far more dangerous than anything Jack had faced. Whoever was chasing her was not just looking for a fugitive. They were hunting something far more important. "We need to hide," Jack muttered under his breath. He didn't know if Lyra could hear him, but she nodded, her pace quickening. She knew what he meant. They needed to find cover, and fast. They reached a small cave, hidden in the side of a hill, and Jack ushered Lyra inside. It was cramped, but it would do for now. The sound of the ship's engines grew louder, the beams of light moving across the forest floor. Jack held his breath, praying they wouldn't be spotted. Lyra crouched beside him, her eyes still searching the woods outside. Jack could see her muscles tense, her posture alert. Even though she was still recovering from her injuries, there was a strength in her that Jack couldn't ignore. She was tough, maybe tougher than anyone he had ever met. And she had to be, because what Jack had learned in the past few minutes was clear. Whoever was after her was not going to give up easily. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as they waited in silence, the sound of the ship moving further into the distance. Jack exhaled slowly, trying to calm his racing heart. It wasn't over yet. He knew they would keep looking, and eventually they would find them. But for now, they were safe, hidden in the shadows of the night. Jack glanced at Lyra, who was still tense but seemed to relax ever so slightly. He reached out and gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "We'll get through this," he said, though he wasn't sure how. "I'll protect you." Lyra turned her eyes toward him, the glowing green of her gaze softer now. She didn't speak, but the look in her eyes told Jack everything he needed to know. She was in this fight with him, and together they would survive. The night passed slowly. The faint hum of the ship's engines had faded into the distance, but Jack knew they couldn't relax. They had only bought themselves a little time. The pursuit was not over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Jack kept his eyes fixed on the cave entrance, every sound outside making him tense. He didn't know who was after them or why, but one thing was clear. They would stop at nothing to find Lyra. And now that they knew she was here, they would likely return. Jack's mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan. Lyra sat silently beside him, her eyes wide, her senses sharp. She had never been this still before, and Jack could tell that she was listening intently, watching every move he made. Her silence was more than just a lack of words. It was the calm of someone who had been through too much, who had learned to stay silent to survive. But Jack could see the fear in her eyes. It wasn't just the fear of being caught. It was the fear of what would happen when they were found. "We need to move," Jack whispered, breaking the silence. His voice was firm, though the uncertainty of their situation still weighed heavily on him. "They'll be back soon. We can't stay here." Lyra looked at him, her green eyes full of understanding. Without a word, she stood up, stretching her sore muscles before quietly moving toward the cave's exit. Jack followed, making sure to keep low, staying hidden in the shadows. He wasn't sure how they would escape, but he knew they couldn't stay in the cave. If they were caught, it would all be over. They moved quickly, slipping through the forest like ghosts. Jack led the way, using his military training to avoid leaving any trace of their presence. Every crack of a twig underfoot, every rustle of leaves made his heart race, but Lyra stayed close behind, moving with surprising agility despite her injuries. It was clear she had experience in moving silently, as though she had been taught to evade capture her entire life. Her presence, though alien, was more familiar to him now. She was not just a girl from another world. She was a survivor. After hours of cautious travel, they reached a small creek, its waters running silently over smooth stones. Jack knelt by the edge, cupping his hands to drink, while Lyra remained alert, scanning the area. He noticed how her gaze never stopped moving, always checking their surroundings for any signs of danger. It made him feel safer, even though they were far from safe. "We'll rest here for a bit," Jack said softly, though he didn't know how long they could afford to stay. They were deep in the forest now, but the ship that had searched for them earlier could still be hovering overhead. They couldn't afford to be found again. Lyra crouched beside him, her eyes still flicking nervously toward the trees. She seemed to relax slightly, but Jack could tell she was still on edge. He wished he could offer her more comfort, but there was little he could do in this situation except keep them both moving and stay one step ahead. As they rested, Jack thought back to the events that had led them here. The crash, the wreckage of the ship, and then Lyra, lying unconscious in the forest. He remembered the way her wounds had glowed with an eerie light and how her blood had been unlike anything he had ever seen. It was as though she wasn't even from this planet. But why was she here? What had happened to her people? Lyra's eyes met his for a brief moment, and Jack saw a flicker of something in them, something he hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just fear or uncertainty. It was sadness. Deep sadness. The kind of sorrow that came from losing something important. Jack could see that Lyra wasn't just a victim of some random accident. She was running from something bigger, something dangerous. "We need to talk," Jack said quietly, though he knew it wasn't the right time. He wanted to ask her everything, to understand her story and why she was on Earth. But Lyra's gaze turned away, and Jack saw the tension return to her body. She wasn't ready to share. Not yet. He understood. She had been through too much already. The silence stretched between them, but Jack didn't push. He knew that trust would take time, and he wasn't about to rush it. Lyra would speak when she was ready, and until then, he would protect her. He had made that promise to himself. After a short rest, they continued on their way. The forest seemed quieter now, the sounds of the night replaced by the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. Jack felt the weight of their journey pressing down on him, but he didn't let it show. He couldn't afford to show any weakness. Not now. They traveled in silence for hours, using the cover of the trees to stay hidden. Jack had no idea where they were going, but he knew they couldn't stay in the forest forever. They needed a place to regroup, to plan their next move, and they needed information. Jack had no idea who was after them, but there was one thing he was sure of. They weren't going to stop until they found Lyra, and when they did, Jack wasn't sure what would happen. But he wasn't about to let her face it alone. As the night wore on, they reached a small clearing. Jack paused, scanning the area. The air felt charged, as if something was waiting to happen. He had the uneasy feeling that they were being watched again, and for the first time, Lyra seemed to share that feeling. She turned to Jack, her eyes locking with his, and for the first time in days, she spoke. "They're coming," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet determination. Jack's heart sank. He knew it was only a matter of time before they were found. But now, with Lyra finally speaking, Jack realized something else. They weren't just running anymore. They were about to fight back. The words hung in the air for a moment, the tension between them palpable. Jack's eyes locked onto Lyra's, trying to make sense of what she had just said. "They're coming." Her voice had been calm but firm, like she already knew what to do. Jack swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had never been in a situation quite like this, but one thing was clear: they couldn't keep running forever. They needed to make a stand, and Lyra, despite the fear in her eyes, seemed ready to face whatever came next. "How do you know?" Jack asked, keeping his voice low, though he wasn't sure if he could trust the words. They had been on the run for so long that even the smallest sign of danger felt like an oncoming storm. Lyra didn't answer right away. Instead, she moved to the center of the clearing, her eyes scanning the forest around them. She seemed to be listening, waiting. Jack stepped closer, noticing the change in her posture. Her body was tense, but there was a quiet focus in her movements that made him think she wasn't just reacting to her fear. She was preparing for something. Finally, she spoke again. "They're tracking me. They know where we are." Jack's heart skipped a beat. He had suspected they were being hunted, but hearing Lyra confirm it made the situation feel even more real. He had to act, and quickly. "Do you have any idea who they are? What they want?" Jack asked, his voice filled with urgency. He wasn't sure if she would answer, but this time, he needed to know. Lyra looked back at him, her green eyes full of a sadness that Jack hadn't seen before. "They're my people," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But they're not the same. Something happened. Something went wrong." Jack could see the pain in her expression, the weight of the past pressing down on her. He wanted to ask more, to learn about her people and what had happened to them. But now was not the time for questions. They were out of time. "We need to go," Jack said firmly, grabbing her arm gently but urgently. "We can't stay here any longer." Lyra nodded, her expression hardening with resolve. She was ready. They both knew they had to keep moving. The forest wasn't safe anymore. Without another word, they set off again, moving through the trees with speed and caution. Jack could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins, his senses heightened. He knew the hunt was on, and they were the prey. As they moved, Jack's mind raced. They needed a place to hide, a way to outsmart whoever was after them. He remembered a series of caves further to the east, a network of natural tunnels that could keep them hidden for a while. It was a risk, but it was the only option. The sounds of the forest felt louder now, as if every crackle of a leaf or snap of a twig was a warning. Jack's hand never left the rifle at his side, and Lyra moved with quiet precision, her steps barely making a sound. She was still recovering, but she had grown stronger since the crash. She was no longer the injured stranger he had found in the woods. She was becoming someone he could rely on. After what felt like hours, they reached the caves Jack had in mind. The entrance was hidden beneath a thick layer of vines and brush, making it almost impossible to see from a distance. They ducked inside, and Jack took a moment to catch his breath. The cool air of the cave was a relief, but it wasn't enough to calm the nervous energy that still buzzed in his chest. Lyra moved deeper into the cave, her movements swift and practiced, and Jack followed closely behind. He had a feeling that the moment they stopped moving, the pursuit would catch up to them. It was only a matter of time. They settled into the shadows of the cave, keeping as still as possible. Jack's eyes scanned the entrance, his senses on high alert. The stillness of the cave was unnerving. It felt too quiet, like the calm before the storm. "Do you think they'll find us here?" Jack asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra shook her head slowly. "They may not know where we are yet, but they will eventually." The thought sent a chill down Jack's spine. He had seen the technology those people had, the ships, the tracking devices. They could follow a trail across an entire planet if they had to. It wouldn't be long before they were found. But there was one thing Jack knew for certain. He wasn't going to let that happen without a fight. He looked at Lyra, who was still watching the entrance with quiet determination. There was something in her eyes, a strength that he hadn't fully understood before. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a fighter. "We'll have to make a stand," Jack said, his voice low but full of conviction. "We can't just run forever. We have to face them." Lyra nodded, her eyes narrowing. "I'll help you. I have my own ways of fighting." Jack didn't ask for details. He didn't need to know. Lyra had already proven she could handle herself. They were in this together, and whatever came next, they would face it as a team. Suddenly, the sound of distant footsteps reached Jack's ears, soft, but growing louder. They were close, too close. Jack motioned for Lyra to stay quiet, and she obeyed, her eyes locked onto him, her body poised for action. Jack's hand tightened around the rifle, his pulse quickening. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The moment of truth had arrived. Whatever was waiting for them outside, they had no choice but to face it. Jack was ready. He had to be. For Lyra, for himself. The footsteps grew louder as the minutes passed. Jack's heart raced in his chest, every muscle tense, every nerve on edge. Lyra stood beside him, her posture alert and ready. They were both waiting, knowing that whatever was coming for them, it was almost here. Jack's grip on his rifle tightened. He didn't know how many of them there were. He didn't know what kind of weapons they had. All he knew was that they were coming. And there was no running now. The caves were their last refuge. If they didn't make their stand here, they wouldn't have another chance. The footsteps stopped outside the cave entrance. Silence. Jack held his breath, watching the darkened mouth of the cave, the tension hanging thick in the air. He could hear nothing now, but that only made the moment feel even more intense. Then, the sound of voices. Low at first, murmuring in a language Jack didn't understand. His stomach turned as he realized just how close they were. Whoever these people were, they weren't just looking for Lyra. They were prepared to find her at any cost. "We need a plan," Jack whispered to Lyra, not taking his eyes off the entrance. His mind raced, thinking of any advantage they might have. He could hold them off, but for how long? Lyra's presence was still a mystery, and whatever was going on with her people, it was clear she wasn't just any ordinary person. Lyra nodded, her face unreadable. "We wait for the right moment," she said quietly. "Then we strike." Jack didn't argue. She knew what she was doing. Her calmness in the face of danger was something he admired. They had been through so much together already, and Jack had learned to trust her instincts. The moment of truth was near, and he hoped they could outsmart whoever was hunting them. Minutes stretched on, the silence almost unbearable. Jack kept his breathing steady, his senses focused. Lyra moved beside him, ready. They would face whatever came next together. Suddenly, a beam of light pierced the cave's entrance, shining through the thick vines and illuminating the shadows inside. Jack's heart skipped a beat. They had been found. "Stay down," Jack hissed, pulling Lyra into the deeper shadows of the cave. They flattened themselves against the cool stone walls, holding their breath. The light flickered, searching for them, sweeping over every corner of the cave. Jack's hand went to his rifle, but he knew they couldn't fire until they were sure they had a clear shot. The voices grew louder again, this time more distinct. Two figures entered the cave, their silhouettes visible against the light. They were tall, humanoid, but their features were sharp, their movements precise. Jack could feel the tension rising in the air, the fight coming closer. The first figure stepped fully into the cave, the light illuminating a face that looked almost human, but with cold, calculating eyes. Jack's fingers tightened on his rifle. This was it. Then, without warning, Lyra moved. She was faster than Jack could react, her body a blur as she darted from the shadows. using the darkness to her advantage. In one swift motion, she disarmed the first figure, twisting his arm behind his back and sending him crashing to the ground. The second figure reached for a weapon, but Lyra was already on him, faster than he could respond. Jack watched in awe as Lyra fought with precision and speed. She wasn't just defending herself, she was overpowering them, taking control of the situation. It was clear now that she wasn't just running from her people. She was a warrior, trained in ways Jack couldn't even begin to understand. The two figures struggled, but Lyra had them pinned, and Jack saw an opportunity. He sprang into action, moving quickly to take down the last figure. In seconds, the fight was over. The two attackers lay unconscious on the cave floor, and the cave was silent once again. Jack stood still, breathing heavily, his rifle still raised. Lyra was already moving toward the fallen figures, checking for signs of life. "They'll wake up soon," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the intensity of the fight. "We need to go." Jack nodded, lowering his rifle. The adrenaline of the moment began to wear off, and his mind cleared. He realized something. Lyra had been right. They had made their stand, and now they had to move before reinforcements arrived. "Where do we go from here?" Jack asked, looking at her. Lyra's expression softened, a rare hint of vulnerability in her eyes. "I'll lead us," she said, her voice calm but filled with a quiet strength. "I know where we can be safe." Jack felt a surge of gratitude. Despite the mystery surrounding her, Lyra had proven time and again that she was more than capable of handling herself. She wasn't just a lost alien girl. She was a survivor, and Jack would stand by her. Together, they left the cave, the morning light beginning to break through the trees. They didn't look back. The fight was over for now, but the journey wasn't. There was still much they didn't know, still much to discover. But one thing was certain. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. As they disappeared into the forest, the first rays of sunlight bathed the world in a soft glow, and for the first time in weeks, Jack felt a sense of hope. They had survived, and they would continue to survive. Together.